wanted to bring your attention to something that Tulsi Gabbard posted on Twitter just recently about big tech and overreaching government and political correctness being an attack on free speech, civil liberties, etc. And she says we need to preserve our American values or something at the end. It's interesting then on Twitter she leaves out the political correctness in the Twitter when she's writing it out on Twitter, but she mentions it in the video, which is interesting. I'm not sure why that is. I'm pointing out Tulsi Gabbard doing this because it's actually part of a wider problem in the so-called left. If you can call these politicians left, I don't know. But anyway, left is sort of a relative term in people's minds. You know, some people call themselves left and they're totally for imperialism, etc. And some people call themselves left and exclude, you know, certain minority groups. Some people call themselves feminists and exclude trans women. There's a whole bunch of distortions of various terms. When we come to the issue of the Democratic Party and what they do with identity politics and how some people on the left seem to be using that to, in some ways, I don't know if they're consciously doing it or it's sort of an unconscious thing, but it ends up dumping on minority groups. But anyway, the Democratic Party, often, anybody who's aware of how they really function, I'm not talking about clueless celebrities that think everything the Democratic Party does is great and that vote blue no matter who and all that sort of thing. Anybody pays real attention and does any research into what the Democratic Party does, and those oligarchs that are in the Democratic Party and people like Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi and all of that know that these people are totally on board with war. They really don't care about black people whatsoever. They don't care about indigenous people. They care about lining their pockets and with lobbyist money from Big Pharma and the health insurance industry and the weapons industry and so forth. So anybody who's got a clue about the US Democratic Party probably knows that, and actually if they do any research into them, they're as big on war as the GOP. They just do it in a less crass way than, say, Donald Trump. So anyway, the US Democratic Party exploits identity politics. They exploit black people, they exploit gay people, they exploit Latinos, they will exploit any minority group, any race they can to deceive the public into thinking that they support you, they support your cause, they support any sort of attacks on you or any sort of oppression of you and so forth. But in reality, it doesn't actually work like that. It doesn't. So that's what the US Democratic Party does. They exploit identity politics. And sadly, I've noticed, and this kind of drives me a bit spare really, and it's also a worry, I've noticed that a lot of people on the left and people who call themselves, and people who say they're on the left, tend to use or tend to give as an example of what's wrong with identity politics, what's wrong with minority groups and black people or whatever organizing. They use the Democratic Party's exploitation of identity politics as what this actually is. You know, it's like that it's a huge problem. Yes, it's a huge problem that the US Democratic Party exploits identity politics and uses it. For example, Pete Buttigieg is gay, and he's an Afghan veteran or something. He's a neoliberal. He's totally fine with war. He's for pro-Israel and the whole thing. It makes no difference whatsoever if he's gay. Not one difference if he's gay. Kamala Harris is a person of color, but she's totally been happy throwing black people in prison and laughing about it. She's a real problem for black people. And she's totally imperialist. She's totally on board with any war. Any war is fine. She's totally on board with overthrowing Venezuela, and she doesn't care about the 40,000 Venezuelans who've been so far killed through U.S. crippling sanctions. All of that. I could have a big long list about Kamala Harris. Juan Castro, he's Latino. So what? He's totally, I think he's an imperialist. He's a neoliberal. Anybody who was up on that stage that, they've used in the Democratic debates that's either a person of color or sort of gay or whatever is as problematic as the rest of them, even more so, because it's almost like they're using that particular identity as like a Trojan horse to get in, and then they just do whatever the hell they want. One can guarantee that if Kamala Harris gets in, which is unlikely, I think Trump is going to win because the Democratic Party have just been shooting themselves in the face over and over again with Russiagate and all that sort of thing, and they're ignoring people that actually have good domestic policies like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is problematic. He's an imperialist, but he has good domestic policies. But just say Kamala Harris got in and became president of the United States. It'd be like Obama 2.0. That's what it would be. She'd be totally on board with everything that's pro-Israel, giving them $10.5 million of military aid a day and keeping the apartheid situation and the execution of Palestinians and all of that going. Worse than apartheid is happening in Palestine and apartheid Israel. That's what she'd be doing, and she'd be totally on board with any war that was brought to her. That's fine. You'd never see Medicare for all. You won't see any real change at all. And yet you'd swear she was some kind of lefty on Twitter most of the time, except for the war thing, which she doesn't mention. But she's totally on board with that. So that's sort of Kamala Harris, and that's what would happen if she got in. This whole this Trojan horse using identity politics that the Democratic Party does is a real problem. And I would have hoped, and I would hope that anybody who is making any commentary on the left about the Democratic Party highlights the fact that that's what the Democratic Party does. That there is no problem with minority groups organizing themselves. There's no problems with LGBT people organizing themselves and black people organizing themselves and all that sort of thing. That's not a problem. What is a problem is when politicians disingenuously, deceptively use this idea of diversity and all supportive of diversity that they proclaim to be, but in actual reality it's not like that at all. When they do that and they exploit it so that they can get people to vote for them, that's the problem. And I get so tired of sort of people not explaining that when they talk about ID politics and they talk about how problematic it is and all this sort of thing. ID politics used by the Democratic Party is problematic. People in various minority groups organizing for themselves and all of that is not problematic. What is problematic is if different minority groups and black people or whatever are only interested in their own issues and they don't see the wider picture of class and of imperialism and all of that. That is a problem when everybody is so focused on their own issue and they don't care about other people's struggles and they don't see that class struggle is also very, very important. That's a problem. But I see, that's not just solely minority groups, sort of, for want of a better word, blind spots. That's probably that's an ableist term, but they're sort of an area that they do not see, or think about. Any group that is just focusing on their own thing and isn't looking at the wider picture, that's a problem. That is a big problem. And we won't get anywhere if we're totally focused only on our issues. I understand that any group that is, like, for example, trans people, that any group that is being oppressed and killed, like trans people are, particularly black trans women in the US, are being killed often. There's a couple of dozen already this year have been killed. I understand why there has to be a major push on some issues, and sometimes it can look like groups are only focused on that. I totally get that. I mean, I was involved in a campaign last year and the beginning of this year for some legislation changes in Tasmania for trans people. And, you have to, because there's so much bigotry on this issue, and because now that marriage equality is passed in different places in the world now, sadly the Christian, and I put that in quotes, Christian bigots and other bigots are now turning on trying to find another issue, another group to vilify, and that happens to be trans people now, because it's not so easy to vilify now gay people because marriage equality is kind of passed, and most of society in some ways is on board with and is accepting of gay people or whatever. sadly, it's sort of, there's this small group of unfortunate people who like to, who will sort of find a vulnerable group and then turn on them because it's easy to do so, and because most of the society isn't understanding of that group, and so it's easy in some ways to sway people to turn on those particular groups, because there's a lot of ignorance around trans issues. In fact, there's a lot of ignorance around trans issues on the left. It reminds me of when there was a lot of ignorance about the Palestine issue, and people were afraid to say something because they really didn't understand what was going on, because there's so much media propaganda about that, and so much government propaganda about Palestine, and that they're terrorists and they're this and they're that, and they're born terrorists. This kind of awful racist rhetoric that is put out there. In some ways it's sort of been a bit like that, or a lot like that, in the mainstream media in Australia in particular, where they've even dedicated segments of Australian newspapers like The Australian to dumping on trans people. They literally have dedicated a section of the paper to doing that, newspaper. So it's not surprising that, particularly when there's a lot of social inequality in any country, when there's a lot of downturn of the economy due to neoliberalism or whatever, neoconservatism, when there's a lot of, sort of people struggling, the governments try and focus their anger on and divide communities, and they often will try and, find a group to vilify. If it's not Muslims, it's trans people or whatever. And that's what they do here in Australia, the right-wing government here, the Scott Morrison government. All governments do it, and they've been doing it throughout history, rather than getting people. It takes away the focus from them and what they're doing and the mess they're making, and how they're ignoring the public purpose, how they're ignoring all of us to line their own pockets and to serve corporations and the military industrial complex and all of that. And in this case, also in Australia, the US Empire. We serve the US Empire, which is a vassal state here in Australia. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that, when Tulsi Gabbard says things like, political correctness is attack on our freedoms, what the hell does that mean? I mean, do we want to go back to the 50s or the 60s or the 70s even, where everybody was, it was fine to say whatever the hell you wanted about gay people, or trans people weren't even on the radar then, but gay people, I happen to know because I belong to that group. I don't really like to label myself as gay. I'm not into labels very much at all. I don't like it. I think, why should I have to label myself when heterosexual people don't have to label themselves? Why do I have to highlight myself? But anyway, and also there's a lot more to me than that. And I consider myself fluid as well. So it's sort of like, I don't really like labels, but I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of bigotry, because there was no political correctness at all in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, really, even in the 90s, So I know what that's like, and it's not fun. I've had people, I'm even sure that there was somebody we still can't be sure, but I'm even sure that we were targeted by someone, and they actually managed to kill one of our cats one time. This was only about 10 years ago now, which was appalling. But I'm sure that I've also missed out on positions and missed out on being included in things, and I've been excluded in my family, and made invisible by relatives and close family. I've been, all of that. I've been sexually assaulted because of that. There's a whole list of things, and that came from the fact that homophobia was, really kind of, it wasn't really such a problem. You could say stuff about gay people, that's fine, really, because most people sort of didn't have much awareness about it. And also there was this underlying homophobia, fear of difference, in a heterosexist society. That's what happens when you have a certain amount of ignorance about a group in a society. And by the way, a lot of it is driven by these faux Christians. I've been bailed up outside a dance I went to in the late 80s. I was with my partner, and these pretend Christians were all standing around us, all happened to be men, and wouldn't let us go to our car. And luckily we weren't too far from the actual dance that we were going to, because we were able to then, we were still within public view, and we just went back inside the dance, you know. So it's sort of like, you know, because we didn't want to be there surrounded by 4 or 5 of these pretend Christian, born-again Christian men. And they were actually, there was a bunch of them outside in the front of the place, you know, sort of shouting sort of homophobic stuff. I mean, this is in the late 80s. You know, I've had police in Queensland, you know, pulling me up in my vehicle because I had, you know, sort of coloured hair or something at the time, and I might have looked, you know, their idea of what gay people look like or whatever, and they'd pull me up and they'd basically search my car with, there would be other people there. They'd search my car because of how I looked. You know, it's been a long, like I could ream off dozens and dozens of examples. And I've had friends beaten up, friends beaten up by drunken straight men that are misogynist outside of clubs and stuff. Anyway, it goes on, and this has a psychological impact on people in LGBT groups. You know, and physical impacts, and it creates a lot of problems for individuals. And when you don't have any support at schools, which is what I didn't have any support at school through primary school in the 60s and through high school in the 70s, you know. There was no support from my family or anything. They kind of, still even, really, they don't bother with me, and or won't acknowledge it. My mother is okay. She's welcoming of my partner, but she doesn't like to acknowledge things in a outward sense, in a sort of a, even to us, you know, it's like this sort of, there's this acceptance of my partner, but it's also this non-acknowledgement that we're in a relationship. I mean, you know, it's all weird. I'm probably sort of saying too much about myself, but I'm just trying to get across that, you know, political correctness actually does affect people's behavior towards, it doesn't eliminate, it doesn't get rid of homophobia or transphobia or racism or sexism or misogyny or heterosexism, etc. It doesn't get rid of it, but it makes people see that it's not okay to vilify minority groups just because they're a minority. And in a democracy, we're supposed to be protecting minority groups. We're supposed to be protecting vulnerable groups, and we're supposed to be protecting different races and so forth. We're supposed to, you know, democracies, which there are none really, real democracies that I can see. But in a real democracy, that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be looking after all people. We're supposed to be looking after all people. And I'm vegan, so we look after, we should really consider non-human animals too, the ones we eat, wear, and use. We should be looking after all people and non-human animals, meaning when I say looking after non-human animals, I'm not talking about domesticating them and keeping them as pets in quotes and all of that. I'm talking about just not domesticating, not interfering, not exploiting, not using them as resources and property and so forth. So I thought I'd throw that in there, talking about vulnerable groups, because despite the fact that there's that we're only less than 1% of the planet's population and the rest are non-human animals, we are destroying their home, and we're exploiting whomever we can, whatever species we can, and species are dying off at 200 species a day because we are mostly because we're consuming animal products, and it's helping a major driver of the climate emergency. Anyway, I'm getting off the track about Tulsi Gabbard and her comments about political correctness, which interestingly she didn't put on Twitter, which I find interesting. Why would you leave that out? Unless, of course, you were running out of characters. But anyway, so really, is that really something to be that concerned about? How about her position about her non-position, her position that she's taken about being against the BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions, which would help end apartheid Israel. and I'm doing them a favor by calling it apartheid because it's way, way worse than that. How about that? That's sort of like, is that American values? Whatever that means. What are American values? Please, somebody explain that to me. I don't even know what Australian values are anymore because it certainly isn't being demonstrated to me here in Australia, whatever they were. It used to be about fairness. It used to be fairness usually to white people, but but it used to be about fairness. Anyway, so whatever American values are, does she think that supporting a worse than apartheid regime that executes children and paramedics and paraplegics at the fence of an open-air prison that is Gaza, does she think that's American values? But she's against the BDS campaign, which is probably the only thing now that would end that? Really? So she's very selective of what she thinks is American values. And she's very selective with what she thinks is peace. She says she wants peace and she doesn't want war. Well, you know, if you want peace, then how about starting with not supporting a brutal occupation of a people where there's a genocide taking place? How about that? This sort of selective stuff that politicians do, it's very tiresome. But it's also, but what can one expect from politicians? That's what I think. Sorry, Arun's getting very, very enthusiastic here on my lap. What does she mean by political correctness? I'd really, really like to, and this is the other thing that worries me about that. That's the other thing that worries me about what Tulsi Gabbard said. I feel like it's a bit of a dog whistle to the right, because that is something that people on the right tend to do. I'm not talking about everybody on the right, but most people on the right tend to do is they do these promotions of, political correctness, it's all effed and it's ruining everything, and they're always complaining about it. And comedians sometimes complain about it. That unfortunate Bill Maher, who's sort of an Islamophobe, and he complains about it. It's this thing like, it's okay for minority groups and people who are disenfranchised, it's okay for them to maybe want a little bit of respect, but if you want full respect and you want to be sort of considered like we in a heteronormative white sort of dominated society, then that's too much. It's too much. It's too much to ask, and it's getting a little bit too much like that. So we want that to stop. That's what that sort of says. I feel like there's even people on the left, and that are sort of doing that. It's like, oh, it was okay. You got your marriage equality. Now shut the fuck up, sort of thing. Now everything's fine. You're able to marry. That's great. And now stop with it. Is there sort of people that take things too far and take political correctness to a ridiculous degree? Yes, of course there is. In every group, there are sort of extreme people. And in some cases, there are sort of people who are intentionally doing that, trying to destroy movements. You get it in all kinds of movements. You get it in all over the place. There'll be people that are almost like agents provocateurs that are trying to basically destroy movements and pit people against one another. I mean, there was actually a 4chan thing where they were trying to, 4chan was trying to put bisexual people against pansexual people and saying that bisexual people are for this binary thing, which means they're anti-trans, they're transphobic. And they were trying to do that. There are people that are actually trying to stir up shit all the time. Does it mean, though, that, say, if somebody from a trans group does something that's outrageous, or sort of wants something that might seem out there, that then we take that as an example of the whole group? This is these fallacies of generalizing about a whole group based on somebody who's done something that might be extreme or off. It's like what I experience sometimes when as a vegan, the way that the governments and certain corporations are trying to vilify vegans and make out like vegans are sort of some kinds of extremists or something, because maybe there was a few people that may have stopped some traffic, or they've done something. I don't agree with these actions where people are going into restaurants and shouting at people. That's actually not going to make anybody stop eating animal products and using animals, shouting at them and trying to humiliate them in a restaurant or whatever. But they'll use, and oftentimes those people that do that, they're not actually vegan. They're actually, in some ways, some of them are misanthropists, but they aren't vegans. And in actual fact, groups like, say, Direct Action Everywhere actually argue against veganism, like because it gets in more people to their group if they don't challenge anybody to go vegan. So they get people in their groups and people making donations, and these people think they're discharging their moral responsibility by making donations, and they don't have to go vegan. They don't have to stop. You can't be an animal rights activist if you're still eating, wearing, using animals. You cannot be an animal lover. I hate that term. If you're still eating, wearing, and using animals, you cannot be that. Okay. So anyway, but what I'm saying is that people will use, examples of people, shouting at people in restaurants and trying to humiliate them as an example of what vegans are, and then try and generalize about all vegans based on a couple of people. So that's what happens with this sort of, the political correctness. It's just outrageous, and it's gone too far. This political correctness gone too far. I feel like that is used disingenuously as a pushback on, this sort of even if it's an unconscious bigotry towards different minority groups and, say, black people, etc. It's an unconscious bigotry of sort of, they're just getting too many, they're starting to get equal rights with us, and we don't like it. And we don't like having to watch our P's and Q's, and we don't like, we feel like we should be able to just say whatever the hell we want, or say the occasional sort of slur against them, and that should be okay. And some people just want us to go back to how it was, where you could just say whatever the hell you wanted about, gay people or trans people or black people or whatever, and that it's just fine, thank you very much. There's a lot of people just want to go back to that. It's too much. Firstly, they've got those bigotries there, so they just want to be able to return to that. And as I said, having political correctness doesn't get rid of these forms of bigotry. People will still say all sorts of effed things in private. They will, and they do. To think that, say, marriage equality, now everything is hunky-dory, that most people aren't homophobic is just deluding ourselves. But it certainly does help when you don't have to listen to or have people shouting at you things, or that you have to deal with oppression in a kind of a private way because the rest of society is just not caught up to speed or on board with this sort of thing. The fact that we even had to do a marriage equality survey a couple of years ago, where people in Australia, it was a survey, people in Australia were asked, do you think that same-sex people should be allowed to marry? I had to participate in that survey. It was disgusting. Imagine if you were a heterosexual person and you had people having a survey in your country, should opposite sex attracted people be allowed to marry? Imagine being involved in that and having to participate in that. I mean, that's a sort of, it's sort of outrageous, really. But anyway, so I'm really raving on here, and it's a bit of a vent and a bit of a rant, because I've just seen so many different commentators now on the left, and I don't watch the right really, but it doesn't take much to sort of see them dumping on minority groups and wishing everything would go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But on the left, people inadvertently, whether they realize it or not, are dumping on minority groups when they start to vilify identity politics, how it is presented by the Democratic Party, how it is exploited by the Democratic Party. And I wish that people would explain that that identity politics and groups that are organizing, that are minority groups or whatever, that is totally fine and necessary, and it has nothing to do with how the Democratic Party is exploiting identity politics. It has nothing to do with that. And I sometimes wonder whether, it feels like a pushback from some of the on the left and on the right. It feels like this pushback on progress. And yes, some people, a small number of people, whether they are doing it in a deliberate way to be divisive, or whether they are just sort of gone sort of ridiculous, have exploited, have sort of taken some things too far. Nothing, but the general population of those particular groups probably don't go with that, don't endorse that. People in disenfranchised groups and in minority groups or whatever just want to be treated like everybody else, which isn't so good these days with neoliberal governments as they are, but they just want to be treated as everybody else. They don't want to be isolated or excluded, and they want equal rights. They don't want to be tolerated. They want to be accepted, and that's all there is to it, really. You know, it's no biggie. And political correctness is not an awful thing. Trust me, it wasn't fun when there wasn't any in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It wasn't. It was fucked. And it caused a lot of violence to my friends, to me, which, you know, I still pay for. You know, so it's not fun, and we should not be going along with it or being silent about it, and we should be trying to clarify the whole U.S. Democratic Party's exploitation of diversity and all of that, and expose it for the Trojan horse that it is to get, you know, to just make people vote for them, to get people to get votes, to get in. But they don't care about those groups. So we should make a differentiate between that. And I don't appreciate, I don't know what Tulsi Gabbard means when she said that that's an attack on freedom of speech and all of that, this political correctness. I don't know what she means, but putting it out there like that in a generalized way is at the very least problematic. And I really feel in some ways it's a dog whistle to the right, because she wants as many people to vote for her as possible. She's trying to bring people in. Just like supporting the anti-BDS legislation was a dog whistle to the Zionists, to anybody that's pro-Israel, and also that the Democratic Party would like that too, because they get a lot of lobbying money from AIPAC, from the Israel lobby. So it's her way of pleasing the Israel lobby, and she's been pleasing the Israel lobby for a long time. She gave a speech at Christians United for Israel, which is an extreme right-wing group. She gave that in 2015. Nobody mentions that, but it's a really full-on speech. You should watch it. And I still believe she probably holds a lot of those beliefs and those things she mentioned in that speech, because she never really clarifies her position about whether, as President of the United States, she would still give Israel $1.5 million every day of military aid. She hasn't said that. She hasn't said she rejects what she said in that 2015 speech to Kufi, you know, because nobody can really pin her down on that. But she's got, but I would say that she's pro-Israel pretty clearly now, you could say that. And that means that she's pro a genocide of Palestinians, because that's what's going on. You know, they openly call for genocide against Palestinians in Israel, a lot of the population. And the government is totally right-wing, totally is trying to do that. So, you know, that's all you can say about that. So anyway, this isn't really just about Tulsi Gabbard, but I don't appreciate her putting that out there on top of everything else. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I don't appreciate, you know, people who call themselves on the left, sort of misrepresenting what identity politics, you know, misrepresenting the struggles of minority groups by using the U.S. Democratic Party's exploitation of identity politics. I don't appreciate that, and I wish people would fucking stop that. Because it's actually undoing, whether they realize it or not, it's actually, because there's no explanation, no clarification, it's actually, in some ways, to a degree, dumping on on minority groups that are struggling and trying to organize. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say, so thanks so much for watching. I hope I explained that properly. I hope that I have got things clear. I'd like somebody to ask Tulsi Gabbard to clarify what she's talking about with identity politics, what examples she could give. That would be interesting. Okay, so please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notifications bell, otherwise you don't receive notifications when I drop a video. Please like if you like the content, and thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vigo. Till next time, bye for now.